get started with our second panel in the interest of time. We do have quite a bit programmed for the rest of the day. Film screening coming up in about an hour and a half or so. Or you can look at your schedules and see them. We do have some schedules up front. And of course we do have Dr. Pierre's keynote address, which will happen later in the afternoon. Both the events in the afternoon, by the way, will happen in the larger room to the back, the Maxcade room, where we'll have a little bit more space to view, and perhaps we'll even have a bit more company, judging from what the RSVP looks like so far. This panel is dedicated to thinking about race in continental Africa. And we have a wonderful panel together here. Jasmine Blanks-Jones, Education and Anthropology, GSE, and Africana, I'm sorry. I've got some of my anthropology comrades over here. Another one sitting in the middle, Celina, who is a pre-doc at Dartmouth, and also a candidate here at Africana and Anthropology as well. She has traveled all the way in from Dartmouth to see, or maybe is it New York? Right, Wes? Yeah. To see us today and speak with us, and of course Dr. Pierre traveling hours yesterday to be with us. So, without any further ado, I'll pass it off to Jasmine.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the panel. Thank you, Dr. Pierre, for joining us. It's been a really exciting experience working with Osei over the past several months to think about what today would look like for all of us, and to talk ahead of time about some of our driving questions behind our research. I am a third-year student in the Graduate School of Education in Africana Studies, so I've not yet been in the field, but I come from a background of practice. I taught theater arts in Liberia for many years, and that will be my field site. So thinking through how to frame my project is where I am right now. And I was really inspired in reading Predicament of Blackness, particularly chapter 6, where Dr. Pierre's work asks about, are you an African American in Liberia? That's a really interesting and contentious question because of its history. So my work will be looking at how young people in Liberia think about citizenship as a result of considering the history of Liberia, the citizenship that is racialized intentionally. The Constitution still has a clause that says that no non-Negro shall hold citizenship in Liberia. And under the new election of the president, George Weah, about a month or so ago, he has, in contrast to his campaigning, now stated that that clause will be dropped, which of course will take a constitutional amendment, but there's been a lot of really exciting discussion over the past 2 weeks about what this means for the nation, for the country, and for what it means to hold citizenship in Liberia. So there was an interesting switch in preparing for today. I was originally on the first panel, but with this new thing that's happening that will definitely impact my research, it seemed particularly silent to have me think more about race, since my project is around citizenship. So some of the discourses that I'm thinking through around citizenship come from the original settlers who, well, not the original, well, the original settlers who journeyed to Liberia in the early 1800s and took with them a spirit of what they believed it meant to be Americans, and that didn't change upon their journey. They went very much to begin enterprises and trade with the United States and to maintain that kind of a relationship. The seal of Liberia to this day still says the love of liberty brought us here, as though there are not other people who are there who are already there. So historically and symbolically, there is a lot to consider for young people who attend schools where these symbols are visible and are alive in their day-to-day life in the way that they think about their own emerging citizenship, down to their national anthem that has a lot of similarities with the United States, their flag that looks like the flag of the United States. So there are a lot of historical connections that are repeated in day-to-day life and that shape, in some ways at least, basic understandings of what it means to be a Liberian and what it means to be a citizen of Liberia, and how close the ties are to American citizenship, or what young people might imagine as America. A lot of times in Africana scholarship, we might look at the imagination of Africa for African Americans, but I'm interested in some ways in how young people who have always lived in Africa are imagining what the U.S. might be for them, particularly in the space of Liberia that has this very long history of migrations between Liberia and the United States. The second piece that's very interesting to me with how citizenship is racialized and made alive in interesting ways for young people is that on top of having really entrenched transnational relationships with Black people in America, there is also a very heavy presence of international non-governmental organizations that, as the previous panel said, similar to the United States, it's primarily white people, lots of young women who are from either the United States or from Europe, sometimes from Canada. And these are people who have an ability to shape policy, to work with messaging that is very pervasive in the society. So in 2012, I worked on a project with the children when they were writing a play. And they were writing a play that was about the importance of children having rights. And they said this was the biggest issue in Liberia. It was really important that children had rights. They wrote a whole play on it. It was a phenomenal performance. But when you look at the NGO discourses, that was when the Rights of a Child law was pushed very hard by UNICEF and passed in Liberia. So there's a very strong sense of language around citizenship pertaining to rights and responsibilities that is influenced by international organizations, that is brought into the context of school settings, into recreational settings to the degree that they exist, and that young people are, through the project at least that I'm looking at, are able to perform different ways of performing citizenship. They're able to perform these things in their bodies and to show us in different ways what it might mean for them to become a citizen. Some of the literature that I have been engaging with is around citizenship in Liberia. It comes from the work of Bartels-Swindells, and she is a Liberian scholar, and she says that when we think about citizenship in Liberia, we should really be thinking about it in a triad of passive, active, and interactive. And the passive aspect of the triad, she looks at things like identity-based citizenship, like this is where you were born, your parent is Liberian, so on and so forth. She looks at active citizenship, the practices of citizenship. What is it that you actually do? Do you vote? Do you own a business? Do you own land? And then on the interactive side, she looks at sets of relations. And her research is transnational in nature. She did hundreds and hundreds of interviews in major cities in Europe, in West Africa, and in the United States with the Liberian diaspora and with Liberians in Monrovia to think through what the discourses around citizenship were. Because on top of the non-Negro clause, there's also no dual citizenship in Liberia, which is a very difficult thing to maneuver considering that well over half of the population dispersed throughout the war. So that's why her work centers a broader notion of what citizenship means. And my interest, though, is in how we're thinking about, in the middle of these discourses, what it is that young people are picking up from their day-to-day interactions with the diaspora, with international organizations and individuals who are working on behalf of foreign nations, and of commercial interest as well, and of how these different interactions are mutually constitutive and influential processes, similar to your work in Ghana with the developing cosmopolitan lifestyle of young Ghanaians, how similarly young Liberians may be impacted through cultural production, through access to social media, through family members who send remittances, and then who they argue with on Facebook about who should be president, but they're the ones paying for their phone credit, and other forms of power that can shape how young people see how they fit within society. So that's just a brief overview of what it is that I'm interested in as it relates to your work in particular. I have two questions for you. The first, though, is about your engagement with scholarship across disciplines. Osei initially said that I was in anthropology, but it's because I do ethnographic research. And I'm not necessarily in anthropology, but I am thinking about what types of anthropological theories and frameworks might be appropriate for my project. And I've noticed that you do draw on scholarship across disciplines. And I'm curious to hear you talk about what that has meant for how you positioned your research within the academy, and what affordances it's given you to be able to speak across disciplines in the way that you have. And more so in a reflection of chapter 6 on Are You a Black American? I'm interested in thinking with you about this notion of cosmopolitanism and how in this era of growing technology, how this is potentially felt beyond major cities in West Africa, and what this notion might do for how young people perceive themselves more broadly.
Hi, I'm Celina. Very excited to be here. Just wanted to thank Osei, Dr. Alleyne, for giving me this opportunity to be on this wonderful panel with one of my scholars. So if you guys will bear with me, I'm going to try and think through two different things that I have, as a war nurse, sort of sutured together. So. What began as an ostensibly environmental resource conflict over grazing and herding rights on the Senegal River that runs on the border with Mauritania in the late 80s erupted into a series of attacks in both countries. Tens of thousands of Senegalese and Mauritanians were displaced, while some retaliations even took the form of public lynchings. A report by the Sahel and West Africa Club commented on the crisis, foregrounding its climax with a decades-long assessment of the ecological, geopolitical, and ethnic migrational shifts that led to the violence, ending in the two countries actually severing diplomatic relations for a period of about 3 years between 1989 and 1992. The report focused on the increasingly precarious ecological conditions, and it stated that, quote, agricultural and pastoral activities are increasingly in competition. The nature of the violence that ensued, however, indicated a deeper issue than that the language of ethnicity and cultural practices around environmental resources, so for example, the Alpular nomadic lifeways, for instance, ultimately obscures in my mind. What may have started out as a political problem of resource allocation in a rural region triggered by a drought quickly descended into racial violence in the capital cities of Nouakchott and Dakar, and eventually the expulsion of over 80,000 people, now steeped in refugee status at this period, indicating the underlying presence of race-based idioms of difference that carry with it the potential for dangerous scapegoating. Skeptics may be quick to dismiss the hypothesis of racial discrimination and its prevalence in West Africa, either seeking refuge in an explanation of ethnicity-based lifeways, coming into conflict over resources, as I mentioned, or by simply concentrating on the failure of these relatively new African states to come to terms with their colonial demarcations that arbitrarily divided peoples and resources in relation to pre-colonial political formations. While both explanations are not without relevance, I believe they're insufficient in terms of what the conflict revealed about post-colonial West Africa. Not only did Mauritanians target Senegalese Alpular Fulani herders in the river region, and Senegalese residents and Senegalese residents of Nouakchott, which is the capital of Mauritania, and vice versa, Senegalese targeted Mauritanian traders in Dakar, but Mauritanians also targeted the Haratins, or the Black Moors, racialized as Black through a fraught and continuing existence of slavery in Mauritania, despite their being indigenous to the country and also, citizens of the country, effectively using the conflict as an impetus to expel Black internal others. I signal this event as a way into thinking about the continued relevance of race in the post-colonial moment, and to demonstrate some of the ways other discourses often belie the persistence of racial analyses in Africa today. Dr. Pier's work calls us to place race centrally in our analyses of the social and political life of the continent. In a commentary for cultural anthropology, she zeroed in on a similar incident in Liberia, in which categories of, quote, Black African mercenaries were targeted and held ideologically separate from Libyans, despite the irony that she repeated that, quote, Libya is in Africa. Peer cautions us about the paucity of critical race theory in African studies that leaves us puzzled when incidents of Afrophobia, for instance, arise. She argues that, quote, race blindness, as she calls it, of cultural anthropology cleverly elides racial issues by focusing instead on the vectors of culture and ethnicity, leaving the critical race scholar working in African contexts with few models for theorization. The focus on Afrophobia in South Africa has so far been the most fruitful site for understanding the 21st century phenomenon of African national on African migrant aggression. Pan-Africana's own Kwesi Mkize recently published a piece in The Black Scholar in which he thinks through the case of South Africa to contextualize the, quote, political unconscious of the post-apartheid violence against the African. Mkize tells us, I have become convinced that there is something in the ontology of the nation-state form itself that cultivates a hermeneutics of suspicion toward the so-called foreigner and the African as the epitome of being foreign. Similar to the case between Mauritania and Senegal, the lines between linguistic group, ethnicity, race, citizenship serve to obfuscate the racial grammar these grievances of rights and belongings are articulated through. Popular discourses of subordination towards ethnic, religious, and national minorities have always sought outsiders, an inherent part of any process of nation building in which citizenship is always constructed through a discursive opposition of internal and external others. But Afrophobia specifies this binary to the post-colonial present, in which a narrative construction of Africa is weaponized against those deemed outsiders. And this can be a shifting category, right, of who is the target of Afrophobia. While nation states on the continent simultaneously grapple with the global precarity of their position as still bound to certain position as Africa in neoliberalism's global shadow. This is Ferguson's term. Given Achille Mbembe's assertion that no African is an outsider on the continent, I follow Mahmoud Mamdani and Jemima Pier's work in their call to see racially motivated hostility in South Africa as merely a more extreme example of what is endemic to all post-colonial African societies, carrying the legacy of colonial structures of racial hierarchy. In this regard, Senegal must not be overlooked. If Africanists, and I would argue wider global publics, are only able to recognize issues of structural racism in former settler colonies like Kenya and Algeria, I guess white settler colonies, and primarily South Africa due to its history of formal apartheid, then a country like Senegal often stands at the other end of the spectrum for its perceived racial homogeneity and presumed absence of internal racial grammars since the country gained political sovereignty from France, or since it gained political sovereignty. Given the under-theorization of race on the continent, my own work in part pushes back on this myth of Senegalese exceptionalism that upholds the country as a relatively stable democratic society with a unique form of religious and state co-governance. This exceptionalism also extends the national discourse of ethnic diversity that moved into the post-colonial era without any major internal ethnic conflict, except, of course, the secessionist movement in the southern Casamance, which also is an ethnically based issue, but of course that's an aberration, right? In this so-called model of African democracy, there are various categories of people that often constitute the common sense binaries that shape the social hierarchies of belonging. One is that of a tubab, a white person, often used in contrast to an African, okay? So this is the first binary. Although many people who have resentment towards the presence of whites or Westerners may use this term to say negative things about them, generally the term as it operates in day-to-day social life is not automatically derogatory, but merely playful or just descriptive. Another common binary, also implicitly using Africans, but in a derogatory sense as an outsider, rather than signaling a local insider or continental kin, is that of Nyak or Senegalais, right? So there's we have Tubab and African, and then Nyak and Senegalais. So Nyak is essentially a bush person, right? That you'll see this kind of category in a lot of different languages, not just on the continent. So Nyak is a derogatory term often used to be in opposition to Senegalese. By juxtaposing these two binaries of African and Tubab and Nyak and Senegalais, we see that the first African against Tubab, usually white Westerner, is glossed as an inclusive spirit universal to the continent. In the second, African, read as Nyak, is at times even a racialized outsider, positioned against a civilized Senegalese whose exceptional colonial relationship with the French and Islamo governing structure gives them proximity to Western conceptions of advancement and modernity. Analyzing social Senegalese dynamics in light of this increasing Afrophobia might then seem useful only as an opposing example of an exceptional African country's democratic stability and relative absence of xenophobically motivated crime. This variant of Afrophobia is thus distinct, in fact, from that of the spectacular violence that accompanies the phenomenon in South Africa. Targets in Senegal, for instance, can take the form of middle-class student migrants rather than working-class labor migrants, and violence is not often a feature of this exclusionary sentiment. Instead, Afrophobia manifests in subtler and sometimes, like in the issue with Mauritania, not so subtle forms of discrimination in Senegal's social landscapes. Amongst youth, it's often displayed in segregated spaces of leisure, the circulation of cautionary tales and insulting remarks about foreign African ways, and the use of the derogatory lexeme Nyak to index African foreigners deemed less sophisticated than Senegalese and therefore inferior. So here we're going to flip a little bit. On the other side of the coin of the race blindness about the continent are the ironies and misrecognitions found in one of the social sectors seemingly primed to be a space of dialogue around racialization, racial unity, and historical structures of racial inequality. That is, the world of Pan-African, diasporic, cultural, and expressive cultural production. This can take many forms, with two modalities in particular that I want to talk about today. The first is through diaspora or roots tourism, or other international state-sponsored events on the continent like FESMANS, or the World Festival of Negro Arts, and PANAFest. The second is through more grassroots initiatives with a particular artistic medium or community. So following Dr. Pierre's theorization of diaspora tourism in Ghana that are often centered around Black American aspirations, I look at diasporically oriented cultural projects by urban West African youth who look across the Atlantic for cultural resources to create their own expressions of Blackness and fulfill desires of global Black kinship, primarily through the practice of Afro-Brazilian capoeira, which is a martial art. Does anyone not know what it is? Okay, good. Cool. We'll move on. Scholars have argued that most West Africans do not see slavery as integral to the way that they define themselves, and most African governments downplay or ignore that history, storing it only in museums that relegate them to the past. African state discourse also participates in the hegemonic framework of Africa as past, symbolic, historical, in the narrative of the diaspora, especially for those countries that were central to the operation of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery is often sequestered. By these discourses as defined more expansively. So it can also become a shameful thing, right? That you don't necessarily want to become the starting point for how you tell the story of your nation, right? You want a longer history than starting with slavery. The continued, West African capoeiristas are thus an example of a grassroots rather than a state-driven initiative of a small portion of the general public that uncommonly aims to define themselves through a racial history, in part because of their involvement in capoeira led to physical and intellectual knowledge about the slave trade as a corrective to this absence. Dr. Pierre has called attention not only to the erasure of this discourse in West Africa centered on the African people, and the complexity of relationships different from West African groups. She also calls necessary attention to the unwillingness of Africanist anthropology and African studies, like we've been talking about all morning, more generally to analyze inherent connection between slavery in the Americas and colonialism on the continent. More importantly, this gap, as if slavery didn't exist also on the continent, colonialism didn't also exist in the Americas. It leaves little room to theorize the mutually constitutive, albeit contextually distinct, processes of racialization in the old world and the new world, right? So I look at these capoeira schools in part to explore how and why Brazil in particular holds such a strong presence in the imaginary of West Africans, like it does for most people in the world, I would say. Not only is it the country responsible for one of the greatest national soccer teams, you can dispute that if you like. It is also the land of right. There, shots fired. It is also the land of samba and scantily clad women dancing on pristine beaches, and the biggest party on the planet, right, Carnival. But for many practicing capoeiristas in West Africa, Brazil also captures their attention for its successful portrayal of itself as a racial paradise, a place where blacks, whites, and indigenous peoples have always mixed freely, and as a result, theirs is a country practically void of racial strife. The aspirations, imaginaries, and desires of West African capoeiristas discredits the myth of race as irrelevant to African public consciousness. While some West Africans romanticize Brazil's racial democracy, Afro-Brazilians and Europeans that tag along with them trips to the continent similarly romanticize Africa as a site of historical richness and black symbolism, the site of origins for much of what Brazil prides itself on as a uniquely African-infused but ultimately self-defined Creole national culture. In the long and continuing history of capoeira, we're entering a phase marked by return, and not just in capoeira, right, in general. Recent years have seen an increase in a form of roots tourism to countries seen as sites of capoeira's, the origins of capoeira's geographical, spiritual, and cultural origins. Brazilian and European practitioners organize capoeira's roots tours in search of understanding the African context out of which capoeira's traditions emerge, to perform a symbolic return of bodies to the historical sites of capture that preceded the enslavement, and to bolster local African capoeira community projects in a poetic reconciliation of the past through creative collaboration in the present. These pilgrimage trips reveal the unexpected outcomes of the work many hoped capoeira could do to build transnational community on the ground. The clashing aspirations and agendas of the roots tourism participants signal layers of misrecognition that, as Dr. Peer tells us, index the ways the connected processes of racial colonialism and racial slavery are often decoupled in the present, obscuring this historical relationship. So pilgrimages are one of the ways that this connection is paid tribute to, as a reminder that while the sport has become popular in gyms and dance studios around the world, it's also a rich and sometimes painfully inextricable tie to the global forces of imperial expansion and enslavement. The Brazilians, the Afro-Brazilians mostly, who practice capoeira are thus in a position not only to continue the legacy of that tradition, but have the potential as racialized subjects to harvest greater significance out of a return from the continent of which they are descendant, them personally. But these tourism trips are not, however, limited to Afro-Brazilians. In fact, white foreigners are often the majority of those who attended these structured, pre-organized trips. If there is a Brazilian in attendance, it's often someone who migrated and set up a capoeira academy in Europe, right, and then gained a client base of students and then brought all their white European students to the continent. These events, however, have varying degrees of success and significance for the Africans who participate. While Brazilians and European capoeiristas are also often enchanted with the idea of returning to the source of their practice, their interactions with young West Africans serve the desires of the visitors, betraying the premise of the event as what they often call the cultural crossroads. At events such as these in Benin and the Gambia, seating arrangements, for example, are often segregated around meal times and local transportation. During rodas, so that's the event when you play in a circle, white and Brazilian capoeiristas take charge of the orchestra, the instrumentation, which gives them the status to direct and the participation and the goings-on of the games. These events almost always culminate into a final show, usually a partially choreographed performance of a concise depiction of the story of capoeira from slavery to modern times. In these shows, African capoeiristas are sometimes literally marginalized on stage, as Brazilians and European practitioners are featured to do solos, right? So they actually often physically embody the enslaved that they are depicting, while you have African capoeiristas on the sides of the stage. The focus of these trips is on the expectations of the visitors, and that speaks to the ways that the hegemonic narrative of the African diaspora comes primarily out of a diasporic perspective, as Dr. Peer's work has shown us, leaving Africans to occupy this historical position. On the one hand, Africa is often leveraged as a means of politicizing both white and black foreigners who, after their pilgrimages, return home with a fortified sense of themselves. And I argue this is for two reasons, or it manifests in two ways. The first is their bravery for having gone in the first place. The second is a more self-fulfilling prophecy, a belief that they would be fundamentally changed by their experience there because of their anticipation that Africa would stir something deeper in them, whether it be a connection to nature, to vibrancy of life, or to the rude awakening of putting their own privilege into perspective. On the other hand, African practitioners are left with an unfulfilled aspiration to connect with diasporic kin, further distancing them from recourse to the diaspora for the silence and sequestering of the slave trade in West African political and public discourses. The events are at times a lost opportunity for young people on the continent to look to cultural communities like the Global Capoeira Network as a way of exploring these connected histories of racialization. So towards a conclusion, focusing on these moments of rupture in what is ultimately a Pan-African dream, particularly the disruption of African desires for mutual recognition by those in the diaspora, I believe it's productive for understanding post-colonial outcomes that shape these Black Atlantic rekindling aspirations. These moments are indicative of hegemonies within the global South that are often glossed over for fear of crushing the already delicate dreams of Afro-unity. By grappling with the realities of these diasporic disjunctures and accepting these failures where they occur, we're able to begin recognizing other kinds of collectives forming, new ways of dealing with old problems. In that light, I would like to pose two inquiries, both to our esteemed guests, but also to the audience. The first is something I've been thinking about for a while. So, given the language of global North and global South, and the expectation that these frameworks signal new avenues for cultural and political alliances, do we all think this is a useful framework for critical race theorists of Africa? Does it carry forward the colonial histories and signal their continued relevance, or does it serve to obscure new kinds of divisions that we have the burden of facing, such as new hierarchies within the global South? And secondly, what I've outlined here are two seemingly distinct realms of social and political life in West Africa. The first is a celebratory return moment of racial repair through the projects of diaspora tourism and global Black artistic collaboration. And the second is the insidious dynamic of race-based thinking that hides behind the myth of a racially monolithic continent. In thinking these two phenomena together, I would like to ask you all how we as scholars can reconcile the simultaneous erasure of racial dynamics and histories on the continent, while the continent continues to operate, as we've seen in the first panel, as a symbol and a resource for racial identity construction in the diaspora and political organization. So how are the political and artistic projects of racial unity and recognition thwarted in between this space of local erasure and foreign diasporic catering? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here, to Professor Pierre as well for being here. My name is Osei, Alleyne, Ph.D. in Anthropology and Africana Studies, and currently doing a postdoc that's described as EE at Penn, Experimental Ethnography at Penn, in which I work to foster relationships between departments at the university that are engaged, interested in ethnography as a methodological practice. So that's what I've been doing for the past few months. I thought that in light of the focus on ethnography that I'm engaged in, that I would put together a little piece that had something to do with ethnography itself, in a way. To race the face of God in globalizing Ghana. Race and the face of God in globalizing Ghana. At a bar on the University of Ghana campus in the summer of 2015, I sat with a group of recently acquired Ghanaian acquaintances, making something of a row in the space with our lively banter. We argued politics, economics, hip life, Azonto dance culture, and African football, and the differences between the quality of life in the US and Ghana, between Europe and Africa, as is the custom. I listened as two of my three new young Ghanaian acquaintances continually reassured me that given the chance to acquire a visa to the US, that they would literally spin the opportunity into threaded gold. Given what they had seen of the cars, designer clothes, luxury vehicles, and the towering US skyscrapers, and sprawling urban gauntlets on their mobile phones and computer screens,
features are oddly increasingly present across Accra, Lagos, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, Joburg, and Cape Town. These young men were convinced that they could fare far better than those black Americans whom they believed seemed to squander the opportunities available to them in the proverbial land of milk and honey. A third Ghanaian, Ben, an individual who would remain one of my chief interlocutors throughout my research work and into life to this day, would remain reticent, however, interrupting to give support to my side of the debate. Things on the other side of the Atlantic that trouble some historic body of water, I argued, particularly given the spate of police killings of young black men in the U.S., were not quite so simple. As for Ben, he was a recently expatriated Ghanaian who had found romantic love and marriage to a Canadian woman and had returned only to complete a few summer course credits at the University of Ghana. Ben was to his comrades a full-fledged burgher, a Ghanaian who had traveled outside of Ghana, a person quite literally transformed in the eyes of immobile locals as an altogether different species of national, and acquired near racial differentiation, one much like the term Obruni, fading perhaps with the younger generations in urban usage, but long reserved not only for European and American various white foreigners, but even diasporic Africans such as myself. Named for the city of Hamburg, Germany, which before the draconian visa restrictions of the millennial years had become a major landing place for fleeing Ghanaians during the 1980s Jerry Rawlings military dictatorship, the term burgher rang on the lips of locals who made pains to single out internationally mobile Ghanaians from locals, subverting the ostensible power imbalance of social capital between returnees and locals, recasting expatriates as lesser Ghanaians of a sort, faint of heart really, unfairly fortunate travelers untested by the extended pressure of the power outages, water shortages, gutter overflows, underemployment, and nepotism that belies the outward signs of global capital at work in Accra. Indeed, Ben was very much an anomaly amongst his local peers, a Ghanaian who had literally hit the jackpot, and without diplomatic family ties, local political money, or even blood, juju, or witchcraft money, had made it to America, or should I say in his case, Canada, though this distinction seemed rather meaningless to my cosmopolitan young friend. A surprising turn came in the conversation when one of the local Ghanaians, Kweku, turned a heel on his argument and instead contended that his countrymen and women were indeed quite gullible, easily taken in, given to believing in lands of honey, pies in the sky, and assorted heavens and hereafters. This, he argued, was because of religion. Ghanaians, Kweku believed, were too easily pacified with prayers, miracle water, working preachers, charlatans, and revivalist born-again prophets. In support of his new claim, Kweku weaved an interesting anecdote in the moment. With a club beer in one hand and a pointed finger in the next, Kweku stated, "It is said that in Ghana, that if you get up on a Sunday morning and you are on your way to church and you see a white man along the way, you can go back home because you've already seen the face of God."
It's nice to see. It's nice to see that research validated.
It was a provocative if humorous tale, a richly performative moment, no doubt, one designed to draw reaction from an impressionable foreigner like myself. A tale shot through with a kind of imperial racial dynamics, colonial world orders, and deeply religious overtones that both anthropologists Jameen Pierre's The Predicament of Blackness and Bio Holsey's Routes of Remembrance capture so well. How to think through such a moment, such a comment, I thought to myself. How should an anthropologist of Africa approach a popular discourse, a strand of urban or was it rural folklore such as this? How might a post-colonial theorist press the categories of race, nation, and empire to work in its deconstruction? How might this ethnographic moment, this subject, and his re-narrativized thread of local lore shed light on the historic forces of race, religion, and power knowledge at play in Ghanaian's post-colonial order? What theoretical lenses might aid the critical thinker in unpacking such a provocative tale? What, with its painfully self-deprecating, almost abjected Christianized natives, dutifully upholding and lionizing whiteness and linking even its everyday appearance, extraordinary perhaps to more rural locals, to not only colonial mastery, but but to godlike status itself, linking whiteness importantly to their own spiritual, read here as economic salvation. Colonial mentality, the voice of Nigerian activist musician Fela Kuti screamed inside my head. And while the ethnographer in me held Fela's rants mostly at bay, while in the presence of my interlocutors, I quietly wondered how some group, among the people for whom I had held such admiration and whose entrepreneurial and cultural inventiveness, agency, and social adeptness I was determined to celebrate, could hold such a seemingly backward view of themselves. Whereas the predicament of blackness captures racial dynamics between Ghanaians on the one hand, and assorted Afro-diasporans, African Americans, white Americans, and Europeans on the other, in the course of my own research work, I had the opportune moment to observe forms of internal Ghanaian differing and othering, and the manner in which intersecting striations of language, ethnicity, regionality, political affiliation, autochthony, and religion layer the political and social sphere inside this West African nation. A rather internal racialization, as I suggest here, when the Dr. Pierre usefully points out is closely aligned to broader geopolitical and historical power dynamics, and as such reproduces, authorizes, and launches manifestations of race as a productive and loaded category inside a sub-Saharan continent that is so often, as Dr. Pierre suggests, regarded in the West as racially homogenous. And this is not to say that anthropologists like Mahmoud Mamdani's Citizen and Subject, when victims become killers and saviors and survivors, among others, have not only insightfully unpacked manifestations of difference that have breached the threshold of outright armed ethnic conflict and genocide in parts of Africa, linking these importantly to varied techniques of colonial division and conquering practiced by British, French, Portuguese, and Belgian powers and their white settler populations, but perhaps less has been written about more mundane and everyday forms of quasi-racial differentiation in ostensibly more politically stable African nations, save the near exceptional space of post-apartheid South Africa. Though, as both Celina points out, that Mamdani argues, is not quite so exceptional at all. This perhaps because difference across Africa has largely been treated through anthropological and political historical works, which engage ethnicity, language, tribal affiliation, autochthony, land ownership and indigeneity, and religious practice, thinking through these expressions and effects of migration, urbanization, globalization, and interethnic conflict, and xenophobia. And this is where Dr. Pierre's work, along with other recent monographs on Ghana, like Atto Quaison's Oxford Street and the Itineraries of Transnationalism, Bio Halsey's Routes of Remembrance, Jesse Shipley's Living the Hip Life, and Stephen Felsjar's Cosmopolitanism in Accra, have been so influential to my own work. These works capture sophisticated Ghanaian actors, among other things, negotiating class and ethnic differences that are in many ways immediate byproducts of globally racializing forces, effects which in Ghana are filtered through the relationships that differing ethnic, linguistic, national, regional, and religious groups have had with each other and with white Euro-American patriarchal power writ large. Though I will concede that many works consider Arab and Islamic influence as well as increasing Chinese presence on the continent. How, for example, have the coastal Fanti groups arrayed along Ghana's central region coast and its historic slave castles, with their anglicized first and last names and dialects, positioned themselves vis-a-vis a historic European power, as well as a local state power and its heavy investments in heritage tourism? How have Accra's indigenous Ga communities negotiated the encroachment of waves of regional northern Ghanaians as well as internal migrants from across West Africa? How have internal migrant, largely Islamic groups navigate migration to and squatting in Accra's makeshift shebeens? And how have dominant, heavily Christianized Pentecostal Akan groups linked historically to early 18th century Ashanti internal imperialism come to dominate the socio-political, juridical, and economic sphere in Accra, long seizing and maintaining its links to international merchants and to global money? My own dissertation research project and developing book manuscript, Dancehall Diaspora, Roots, Routes, and Reggae Music in Ghana, rather seeks to explore the manner in which broadly African diasporic popular cultural and musical aesthetics, modes of livelihood, forms of entrepreneurialism, styles of conviviality, forms of political critique, social posture, and social religious practices might mitigate or even exacerbate, in some cases, extant social differences among Ghanaians. My own work explores, interrogates how membership in global musical subcultures of hip-hop, but also decidedly Caribbean forms of reggae and dancehall, as well as Rastafari, each with its own unique constructions of race, gender, class, and sexuality, might contribute to forms of Pan-African solidarity, cosmopolitan consanguinity, and even emergent notions of Afropolitanism that might recircuit otherwise entrenched forms of difference remnant from colonial and post-colonial periods still active in today's Accra. I am interested in how globally circulating forms of politicized and aesthetic blackness embedded in popular culture might give rise to the formation of new communities across ethnic and class lines in Accra and offer economic and political voice to otherwise socially and quasi-racially differentiated marginalized groups in Ghana. And so here a recourse to my provocative banter with Kwaku, Ben, and my Ghanaian drinking buddy. Putting aside the instincts of an anthropologist for a moment, I ask how might a Peter Tosh, Marley, or Lucky Dube respond with their unabashedly black political postures? How might they respond to Kwaku's tale? And I call on the spirit of world-renowned and activist South African reggae artist Lucky Dube to note that his murder at the hands of South African muggers occurred because he was mistaken for a Nigerian and as such a foreign interloper worthy of being killed for his possessions. Such is the degree to which xenophobia has come to dominate the relationship among some national African groups. More importantly, how might local Ghanaian reggae dancehall artists, the many hybrid Muslim Rasta youths from among Ghana's most economically marginal internal African migrant Zongos, who have refashioned themselves in highly politicized blackness, respond to such arcane tales of white worship? Perhaps they might respond similarly to the rants of Fela Kuti in my head, colonial mentality. So the questions that I have, while I argue as you do, Dr. Pierre, that the racialization and racial consciousness that you pick up in the interplay between Ghanaians and various foreigners, black or otherwise, can be further tracked into forms of internal differentiation within Ghana, I nonetheless wonder whether, in your estimation, there are any limits to the application of the analytic of race to the space of Africa. That is, given the genealogies and ontologies of the term and its referential world, particularly as it is emergent in Western academies. Might there be any limits to the application of race as an analytic to the space? I ask this as I also note from my own research that the language of race does not emerge with quite the same frequency, intensity, or referential power among and between Ghanaian groups in reference to one another. And finally, and very simply, a broader question: what has been the pushback, if any, to your well-refined arguments about the explanatory power and applicability of a racial lens to the space of continental Africa? And how have you been moved to respond to these critiques since the release of The Predicament of Blackness, if there have in fact been any pushback? Thank you.
So I must say I'm really overwhelmed by how great all the research being done here is, and it's really a testament to, I guess, whatever you guys are drinking in the water here. I'm joking, but like, you know, really amazing work and really impressive theorizations around particular issues, race, migration, and so on. And so I'm really, this is really a treat for me to be here. I wanted to, I actually wanted to begin with Jasmine's questions about scholarship across disciplines, and I think, and it might answer the thing I wanted to say before I get to that is, when I embarked on this research, there was nothing. Like you know, I was trained in in anthropology, but in an African diaspora program where this Gilroy was king, and we were reading all this British cultural studies stuff, which effectively marginalized Africa because to mention Africa was to be essentialist, right? So that was the starting point, and critiques of, you know, Asanteism, Afrocentricity, and all of that. And so so in that regard, there was no engaging Africa unless you were thinking about Mother Africa, you know, Africa of the 15th, 16th century. And then in African studies, you know, there was, you know, to think about race is just, was back then was just, there was nothing, right? And especially in anthropology or African studies. And so what pushed me out of anthropology, to be honest, was just I hated the ethnographies. You know, all the ethnographies about Africa were about the market woman, witchcraft, the spirit of this, the spirit of that. And if you look at
Still about that.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the titles of books, right, it's about the occult, this and that, and there was a way that, you know, Africa was just like really this this calcified view of Africa as trapped in like the rural, as trapped outside of modernity, as not being coeval. It's about time, right? And so I used to joke, you know, these anthropologists would get off the plane, just not notice Africa until they get to the village, right, and find the bush. And so there was that, and so part of writing this book then had to be going outside. And so I just remember, my first trip to Ghana, I was an exchange student, and with a group of students, and there were 10 of us from Tulane University. There were 10 of us, and 2 of us were black, and the rest of the students were white, mostly women, and there's one guy, I remember him because he had a ponytail, and everywhere, and that's important because everywhere we went, no matter where we went, how deeply rural, like in the middle of nowhere, we'd get out of the bus, and all the kids would run to him and call him Jesus. And it was just shocking to all of us, right? And to him, because he was embarrassed. And it was just, and they associated him with, you know, Christianity and whatever. But also, and you know, I was, you know, 19, so not really trying to understand, trying to deal with that reality of also being treated worse than my colleagues because I looked Ghanaian. And so I was seen as local, and just seeing the deferential treatment towards my white colleagues, the white students in the group. So that was in the back of my head, you know, when I began graduate school. And so then I started thinking about, you know, studying black immigrants in the U.S. and they kept saying, well, you know, I didn't know, this was Ghanaians in D.C. I didn't know it was black till I got to the U.S. You guys hear this all the time, right? I didn't know it was black till I got to the U.S. It's the U.S. that made me black. I just remembered all these experiences, right? And so I had to find a way to start thinking about it. And so I have to say there are three scholars whose work really were influential for me. And the first one was Louis Gordon, which is really, and he has this collection of essays called Her Majesties of the Children, where he's theorizing, you know, black anti-blackness and this idea, you know, black, you know, existentialism, which was so interesting. And then there was Mahfoud Mamdani, who really helped me think about the colonial, the making of the native identity, right? But he doesn't make that leap to racialization, right? So he talks about the nativization, but if you look at it, you see it's a racialized relationship. And then Charles Mills, who writes about he has one essay on global white supremacy. That was the first time I actually had even though Du Bois had actually written about white supremacy before, but that was the first time, you know, when he defines global white supremacy as, you know, this hierarchy of structures. It wasn't about individual relationships. So the first thing is I had to read outside. So if you're looking for something, you can't find it, and you know that it's there, right? Like, you know there's there, but there's no language, there's no way. So I had to go outside of anthropology. And I had to be okay with saying, well, there's something wrong with representing Africa in these terms, which continue, right? I mean, these days it's the development discourse, right? It's about failed states and bad governance and all this stuff, you know, necropolitical stuff, right? About the post-colony, right? Everything that's wrong, that's internally wrong with Africans, right? And so that's how it continues in the ethnographies. But so I had to go outside, and I was reading everything. I was reading philosophers, I was reading political science, I was reading literature, you know, Maya Angelou's book about Ghana was really influential. All of God's Children Need Traveling Shoes. That's the book. And so really that's, and so I cobbled something out of all of these things. The other thing that was really helpful is just my advisors did not believe in the project. They were just like, this is ridiculous. That's not true. What do you mean? You know, and so, but they were great in that they just let me, they were just like, well, you just have to prove it to me, right? And so, and they allowed me the space to like, go ahead and prove it. And so that goes to your question about pushback, because the pushbacks continue. So even though the book's been out, it inevitably, I mean, I just presented just 2 months ago, and what I always get from anthropologists is, are you sure this is not ethnicity? Even though I can spend an hour and a half explaining how ethnicity is structured through discourses and practices of race and empire. It's always that. And so to me, the pushback is a conceptual and theoretical, but I think it's epistemological. I think part of it is like, there's just inability to come up with certain questions because we're trained in particular ways. And that epistemology runs